We've reported before on the impact 9/11 had on media discourse in the U.S. and the way that American Muslims and their religion have been covered by news outlets there, often with fear and suspicion. In 2005, Britain had the 7/7 attacks, which also affected the media in the UK. Read the British press, and not just the tabloids, or go online, and there are some scary stories about Muslims. The most recent being one on a supposed secret Islamic plot to radicalise school students in Birmingham. There's a steady stream of reports on Muslim women and whether they should be covered or not, Sharia law, as well as a recent story on what's being called the surreptitious serving of halal meat to unsuspecting Britons. Is the UK, as reflected through its media, Islamophobic? Or is this just a case of a community growing and the news media failing to cover them accurately? The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Islam and the British media.
Here are the figures. In 2001, a UK census showed that there were 1.5 million Muslims living in Britain. 10 years later, that figure grew to 2.7 million, up by 80%. So inevitably, there would be more news coverage about Muslims. But what would you consider to be a proportionate increase? According to research conducted by the University of Birmingham, in the decade preceding 2006, news coverage relating to Muslims and Islam in British national newspapers increased by 270%. That is more than 3 times the population growth rate. And the study concluded that 91% of those stories were negative. Flip through the papers today, and not much has changed.
Within the last 6 months, you've had from Muslims attending a theme park labelled as hate preachers and extremists. The niqab debate keeps coming back around and around again. The halal was another issue. Trojan horse plot, Muslim schools. When you look at these series of stories, it's putting the spotlight on a very small minority.
For example, if we look at the niqab and the wearing of the niqab, it's likely that less than 1% of British Muslim women actually wear the niqab. And yet when we see the image of Muslim women in the newspapers, I would say around 99% are actually wearing the niqab. So what we see is this gross distortion of the reality, the construction of fear that becomes apparent in the media.
The idea that the British media is in any way Islamophobic, that is to say, fearful or loathing of Muslims, is absolutely ludicrous. What it is an attempt to understand a growing dynamic in Britain. As they exert their numbers, as they now move into education and other areas, it is the job of the media to try and help people who are already here to understand them. It's not fear, it's trying to comprehend and understand.
And according to Engage, a Muslim advocacy group in the UK, they are failing. In 2011, Lord Justice Leveson set up an inquiry into the culture, practices and ethics of the British press following the News of the World phone hacking scandal. Engage took the opportunity to raise the issue of Islamophobia in the country's media. And according to Lord Justice Leveson's final report, the inquiry heard sufficient evidence to conclude that some sections of the press have deliberately invented stories with no factual basis in order to satisfy demands of readership, and that one publication in particular, the Daily Star, published stories about Muslim issues knowing that they were untrue. But misinformation is only part of the problem. It can also be the framing of stories. In 2012, 9 men were convicted of sexually exploiting young girls in Rochdale in northwest England, with similar cases around the country.
All involving mainly British Pakistanis.
Who were all Asian.
Mainly Pakistani Muslim men groomed.
But critics say that as soon as it emerged that the grooming gangs were Asian and Muslim and that their victims were white, that the men's race and religion became central to their offences in the coverage that followed.
That again falls back on this idea that you essentialise religion. You're making religion the reason for those crimes. And I think if you looked at any of the profiles of the men that were implicated in these cases, they were drug abusers, they were alcohol abusers. Very few of them would fit the profile of what a British Muslim would consider a British Muslim way of life.
If we look at kind of other instances of paedophilia where, the statistics show that actually it's mainly a white, middle-aged man who's actually the perpetrator of this. We don't talk about this being a white crime or a white phenomena, but if Muslims are involved, that actually comes to the forefront. So we always talk about Muslim grooming.
But what you have to remember in this case is that evidence was put before the court in Britain that the reason these men preyed on mostly white girls, I'm not saying this is true, I hasten to add, but that what was heard in court was they preyed on white girls because they saw them as cheap, easy and available, and they would never do it with their own Muslim girls. That is why their faith became important. If counsel says that in a court, it has to be covered. I would argue to my journalistic dying breath, it is germane to the story if that's what drove the men to choose vulnerable white girls.
Journalists are often under pressure to get across a lot of information with, in the case of print, as few words as possible, or for broadcasters, as little time as possible. One of the ways they do that is to use journalistic shorthand. And when you look at the coverage of Islamic issues in Britain, certain words, adjectives keep coming up. Terminology that has broad implications, but is short on meaning.
Everything has an IST, so you've got jihadist, Salafist, Islamist. It just feeds into the language in terms of allowing those right-wing journalists their own definition of people, which is a negative definition, and classifying them so that it's easier for their readers to understand that this is exactly who we're talking about. So if, for example, if you call an Islamist here and you call the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist in Egypt, then they're the same people.
It's never just the word Muslim or Islam which is used. So there's always these appellations with it. So it'll be radical Muslim or mainstream Muslim. There's always this demarcation between good and bad. There's always this idea being reinforced that actually not all Muslims are good. So even if there's a good story, they will be referred to as moderate Muslims or mainstream Muslims.
Last month, The Guardian's Nazreen Malik said that there is a cycle of Islamic scare stories that keep resurfacing in the British media. The question is why?
I've been a journalist for probably more than 3 decades, maybe 4 decades, I don't know. All stories are on a cycle. And here's a classic example. In Britain, sometimes we love to do stories about dogs biting children. I don't know why, but in Britain we like these stories. A Rottweiler will bite a child, and these bites are probably going on all the time, but by God, for 2 or 3 weeks afterwards, the newspapers are full of Rottweilers biting children. The reality is, it's selling. It's selling newspapers, it's getting discussion on radio shows like mine, it's making TV bulletins, so suddenly it's in cycle. It's the same, without being offensive, I'm not likening the course to animals, but it's the same sort of thing with Muslims. Suddenly the stories are in vogue.
Causality is a really difficult thing. To suggest that media output necessarily has led to certain changes in society or certain shifts in the way in which Muslims are treated. One of the lasting consequences of media output after 7/7 has been the construction of the entire community as complicit in some of these crimes. And whereas ordinarily you might have identified minorities within that community as part of the problem, certainly in the construction of the war on terror, that you're finding huge majorities of Muslim communities that are now come in for that level of exceptionalisation.
We should have a space where we can actually disagree and debate and contest and challenge. I don't think that's Islamophobia at all. I think where we see that Islamophobia begins to emerge is that when those disagreements or dislikes or criticisms are then used to, sort of homogenously to criticise all Muslims without differentiation, to kind of demonise the religion of Islam unfairly, to encourage hatred or bigotry and even encourage violence. I think that is when it becomes a problem.
British Muslims are a minority, but the majority of news stories about them are negative. Some journalists say they are just trying to, quote, understand the Muslim community. Others say they are merely reflecting society and its attitudes. But take a longer look behind the headlines and those attitudes. That's the real story.
More Global Village voices now on the way the Muslim story is reported in Great Britain.
There is a tendency to depict Muslims and Islam as a religion in a frightening way. The problem is that what you can see also since 7/7 and since 9/11, there is a lack of differentiating between the extremist and the mainstream. Unfortunately, what's happening is that these very rare extremist cases are depicted as representing the whole Muslim community, and that is what makes the relation between Muslims and non-Muslims more problematic.
Where is the religion of the EDL supporters? Where is the religion of those that kill their wives and children at home in Hackney, for example? But a family kills their daughter in broad daylight in Pakistan in front of the court, and it's immediately seen as caused by Islam. Why is there a difference in the reporting of these stories? That's what I would like to know. I think the British media need to wake up to the damage they are causing.